But yes, there was a hiccup. The diseases were definitely a problem. But I don't think the Maori who are there today would say that they would like to go back to the way things were in 1840 before the diseases, but before all of the other things, including medicines, life-preserving medicines, technology, and so forth. And British law, British institutions. Apirananata put it really well in his book about the Treaty of Waitangi, which is so desperately inconvenient to my opponents, because I agree, he agrees with me, that as you sleep, he told the old lady that he'd written the book for, as we sleep, there are 100 laws keeping us safe. Now, that's mind-blowing when I think about it. It's true. If I want to kill you, Vinny, I have to think twice, because there's all these things that would happen to me, which didn't happen before. Maori law was basically might is right. They were basically like sparrows at a bird bath, wondering who was going to come and knock them on the head next, or who they were going to knock on the head. British law brought that security, property rights and security. So I don't know if I've covered the list, Joe, but you know, there is another side to that story.
However, John, you've kind of failed to address some of the points that Joe raised, like, for example, the suppression of the Tauranga Act, and also the banning of Maori language in schools and things of this nature.
Let me do that. I'm not an expert on the Tauranga Suppression Act. I think it was 1908. I presume they had their reasons. Presumably, people must have been dying from dubious, the equivalent today would be, you know, homeopathy for cancer or something. I don't know. I won't pretend to understand that. I do have some enlightenment about the teachers in schools, the language. The Maori chiefs themselves insisted to the Ministry of Education that their children should not be taught in Maori-only schools. They should be taught English. Now, this is what is conveniently left out when Maori people say that, oh, my grandmother was beaten. Well, I'll tell you what, at a boarding school in 1970, we were beaten as well. You know, physical punishment was right through the system in those days and ended relatively recently. But if they weren't allowed to speak Maori, that was at least in part because the chiefs saw that English was the way of the future, a bit like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore deciding that English would be the language of Singapore. Wouldn't have gone down that well, but by God, it's improved Singapore's prospects.
Joe, your response?
Well, I'd like to address some of those points that John detailed out. And the New Zealand Musket Wars, as John mentioned, which is prior to the New Zealand Wars, he said that many Māori died probably in the range of 100,000. Well, one thing, and also his buddy Don Brash mentioned this in the Orewa hate speech. One of the things that really astounds me with this, with these numbers that they've managed to pull out of thin air, is how do they know this? Because there were no births, deaths, and records. No one was calculating how many people were in each iwi in New Zealand. There was no records of birth, deaths, or records of Māori, so you couldn't calculate how many people were dying in these. And I think what they've managed to miss is that when Māori went to war, it wasn't to go and exterminate each other. They did it for this thing called mana. And what they were trying to do was achieve mana. It wasn't to go out and exterminate one another as the history that John's portraying. But also another topic that John brought up was diseases, with when British colonists came over with diseases. Well, actually, a lot of the British colonists were really badly disease-ridden, and what had happened is they'd spent a year on these sailing vessels coming out to New Zealand to colonise it, and the diseases had spread through the ship. So, for example, in Otago Harbour, there's Quarantine Island, where they used to keep all of the new colonists until some of them killed off with disease. So what Māori were excluded from was public health to the 1930s. So it's acceptable that colonists turn up here with diseases, but you do not exclude the Indigenous people from public health when they are also suffering from diseases you've introduced. It's absolutely unfair.
Now, at the same time, Joe, as you're saying, there's no birth and death records and whatnot. Are you also saying that there was a huge amount of Maori who got killed at the same time as not having any records yourself, or is this just the different part of the century we're talking?
Well, they'd done some counting of the Maori race in the 1800s. But prior to the Treaty of Waitangi, there was no... the last count, I believe, was probably Cook. And he maybe put the race at maybe 25,000. But, I mean, that's just...
100,000, I think.
Oh, yeah, you're probably right.
I mean,
yeah.
I'm sure Maori can count. You know, much is made, especially in the Waitangi Tribunal, of the power of Maori oral history. So if we're now saying that they couldn't count how many they had, I mean, this information was gained from various iwi. John Robinson, when he was a scientist, Harvard, I think he was, or MIT, he was hired by the Waitangi Treaty of Waitangi Research Unit at Victoria University. He subsequently exposed their bias and their requirement that he alter his findings because they weren't to their taste, so he's unpopular. Had to put out a book called The Corruption of New Zealand Democracy by pointing that out. But his way of calculating was to take the first known census, the first reliable census, 1858 I think it was, and work back in terms of likely birth rates and death rates. And by that method he got from whatever the population figure was in 1858 back to a plausible estimate of what the population was in 1840, which I think he said was 70,000. As to where he got the figures for how many had died, I mean, it doesn't matter anyway now. It doesn't matter, but certainly there were over 1,000 wars. I mean, of one kind or another. They were constantly at war because there was no property rights. There was no security. The British brought that. What I'd like to jump forward and say is that regardless of all this and who was right and who was eating who and so on, what child today who is Maori or part Maori is disadvantaged by, say, the education system? I mean, Charles Bennett had was honest enough to say that if there's any bias, it's pro-Maori. That was when he was alive, which was a while ago. You know, Maori get every advantage, scholarships and so on, people bending over backwards to help them in all ways in society. What Maori child... I said this to a guy called Carwyn Jones, who I accused. He said, you've called me a sort of pretend Maori. I said, no, I didn't, Carwyn. I called you a make-believe Maori. He says, well, yeah, exactly. What do you mean? I said, well, you're Welsh. You got red hair and white skin, and your name's Carwyn Jones. And I said, what reason do you have for your children getting money from my children? He said, oh, well, my great-grandmother was prevented from speaking Maori in school. I said, well, there you go. See, my wife comes from Taiwan. She's one of those immigrants that Te Ururoa Flavel thinks shouldn't be helped at the expense of Maori. And, you know, guess what? Her son wasn't allowed to speak Chinese in school. I don't think he tried, but, it wasn't encouraged. She taught it to him at home. And I said, what is stopping your grandmother from, what was stopping her from making sure that her children spoke Maori at home? So he wasn't terribly convincing. He went off in a huff. But I do want to know why my children should be paying money. When it comes down to it, it is all about money, not mana. It's about money. There's no mana in taking other people's money.
And considering
I couldn't get an answer.
And considering it was the chiefs themselves who told the ban on speaking Maori in school because they wanted to be taught in English, that kind of makes it not make sense anymore.
Well, those chiefs were very sensible. I think Maori today should give thanks to their people. I don't criticise them. Those same chiefs were into cannibalism and all that stuff. But then so were our lot, if you go back far enough. Those chiefs realised that they had been living a sort of counterproductive lifestyle, and they sought to change. They thought there was much debate at Waitangi. You'll see the speeches left, right and centre. They were clearly of the understanding they were surrendering sovereignty because some of the chiefs absolutely vociferously said, I don't want to be down, down, down while the governor is up, up, up. Go home, go home. In the end, they signed. And in the end, by majority, those chiefs made a great decision for their people, just as we would if the Venusians came and we decided on balance with all the risks of what these guys might do if they don't turn out to be as friendly as we think. with all that, those risks paid off. We took the decision, and the risks paid off, and Maori are doing very well today. Not as well, if you like, because it hasn't been a few generations, not as well as the people who had the advantage of being technologically, more advanced, but very well compared with other, native people and with where they used to be. And we're all doing much better than we used to then. I agree with you, Vinny. It is about, the superior race that I'm in favour of is the human race. We're a wonderful species, how we solve our problems. There's not much between us all. And we'll certainly band together when the Venusians really do come, or the Martians. We'll suddenly realise all these differences that we squabble about are not really at all significant. That's all I want, is racial equality, and for that I'm often called a racist.
Well, can I ask, what's the definition of racism? Is it discriminating against a race, or is it being in favour of a race?
It's both. I deplore apartheid in South Africa. John Minto of the Mana Party was very, very strong, a very strong New Zealander in those days. He has gone quiet when it comes to the black majority rule in Zimbabwe and places like that. I think you've got to be consistent. If you deplore apartheid in South Africa, you've also got to deplore it when it starts showing itself in New Zealand and other places, albeit not as extremely. But when you've got people like Te Oroa Flavel saying that Maori are superior or should get more, that is the same thing. It's on a different part of the continuum, but it's the same thing. And it's my mission to show that Joe's side of the argument is actually where the racism is. And I think that's legitimate.
Joe, can I ask you, previous to, after British colonisation, the treaty and all of this kind of thing, I was thinking about tribes and communities, how they worked and how they maintained their sense of unity together, and whether or not that's eroded over time. And as a result of no longer having community and strong family support networks, and this has happened right across society, there's way more divorce now than ever before, way more delinquent children now than ever before. Are Māori a victim of the same kind of phenomenon as everyone else, with the exception that they get racially targeted by the justice system?
So, are you meaning like back historically?
No. You know how, let's say, for example, not even 20, 30 years ago, everybody used to know their neighbours? Nobody knows their neighbours now. And all that whole community, all that extended family living with you and everything like that doesn't exist now. All of those used to be support networks so that people would keep out of trouble and have some kind of culture for themselves. And now what it is, it's television, drugs, cigarettes, everything coming at you. So you don't stand a chance without a proper support network. Anybody's like that.
Well, historically, how Māori lived is they lived in communal parasites, and so the parasites were very communal. They kind of lived in a whānau system, and it was an ideal type of lifestyle. So there was a Governor Fox, who became the Premier of New Zealand, the Prime Minister, and he once says they are beastly cannibals living in hoary cannibalism, and he despised the fact that Māori were a communal people and they weren't capitalist. So that would probably be why they attacked a lot of the parasites. And so Māori got forced off their lands with the New Zealand Settlements Act, and they had to live in more swampish areas. And so the prime land where the parasites were given over to the British colonists when all this territory was confiscated in the Settlements Act.